The Beatles. I mean, just the name alone, right? It conjures up this whole universe of music, culture, and a kind of fame that literally changed the world. We all know the legend, the four lads from Liverpool who just took over the planet. But what about before all that? You know, before the screaming crowds and the #1 hits, what was really going on? What were the ingredients that created that creative explosion that was the Beatles? Okay, let's dive in and get to the real story.
To do that, we've got to look past the official version of the story, you know? The one that's been polished and retold for decades. We're going to get to something a little more raw and a whole lot more real.
Now, our guide for this journey is Bob Spitz's incredible biography, a book that took nearly a decade of just exhaustive research to write. Spitz's whole goal was to peel back all those layers of legend to find the truth of how it all began. And that's the story we're going to dig into.
And you know, the story doesn't start with a guitar or a song. It starts with a place. To really understand the Beatles, you first have to understand the city that made them, Liverpool.
So this is post-war Liverpool. We're talking about a tough, gritty port city. The Mersey River, that was its lifeblood. It was this constant connection to the wider world, bringing in ships, goods, and most importantly, new ideas. It was a place of real struggle, but also just immense pride.
And the people from Liverpool, they're called Scousers. And that term, it reflects this fierce local pride, a super sharp wit, and a kind of no-nonsense attitude that was born from the city's tough, working-class character. This Scouser identity is absolutely central to the band's DNA.
The city's history is incredibly complex. I mean, Liverpool's economy was first built on the slave trade and then later on cotton. It was also just profoundly shaped by a massive influx of Irish immigrants. And yeah, that includes the ancestors of both John Lennon and Paul McCartney. All this created a crowded, tough environment, a real crucible that shaped the attitudes of everyone who grew up there.
And right at the heart of this origin story is the creative engine of the early Beatles, John Lennon. His genius was forged in a childhood that was defined by this powerful, constant conflict between two very, very different women. On one side, you have his mother, Julia. She was spirited, full of life, but also really reckless and unpredictable. She was the source of chaos and this bohemian energy in his life. And then on the other side, you have his Aunt Mimi, who actually raised him. She was the polar opposite, stable, disciplined, completely focused on giving him a structured, proper upbringing. He was stuck right between these two worlds, every single day.
So here's the crucial point. This constant tension, it wasn't just a challenge, it was the fuel for his art. The source material calls it a discordant upbringing. And that push and pull between Julia's free spirit and Mimi's discipline, that's what created this unique blend of raw emotion, sharp wit, and artistic ambition that would define his music.
So John had the internal conflict. Liverpool provided the grit, but one more ingredient was needed to set it all off. And that was a sound, a new, rebellious sound that came all the way from across the ocean.
Back in the 1950s, British radio was, well, it was incredibly dull. It was all controlled by the state. So the escape hatch for kids like John was Radio Luxembourg, a powerful station that just blasted American rock and roll across the English Channel. It was like a lifeline to a whole different world.
And for John, everything changed incredibly fast. He would listen religiously, literally taking notes. Then he heard Elvis. Heartbreak Hotel wasn't just a song. It was a revelation. It was an anthem of rebellion that spoke directly to him. So he immediately adopted the defiant teddy boy look and finally convinced his Aunt Mimi to help him get his first guitar. The transformation was complete.
So let's pull all these threads together. When you look at all these distinct elements, you can see it's not just one thing that made John Lennon into the artist he became.
It's a pretty powerful recipe, isn't it? You take the grit and pride of Liverpool, you add the emotional complexity of a kid raised by two mothers, and then you ignite the whole thing with the revolutionary spark of American rock and roll. The result wasn't just a musician, it was a force of nature who would very soon meet another boy named Paul and, well, start a band.
And that brings us back to this central question. Looking at John Lennon's story, we see how a specific time, a gritty city, and a chaotic childhood created this unique kind of genius. It really makes you wonder, for any great artist, how much of it is just innate talent and how much is forged by the world around them. In the case of the Beatles, it seems like the world they came from was every bit as important as the music they would go on to create.
So let's talk about a band that, well, they weren't just a band, were they? They were a full-blown phenomenon. They didn't just write songs, they basically rewrote the rules of culture. Yep, you know who I'm talking about. the Beatles. Now, to really get a handle on their impact, we're actually not going to start at the beginning. No, we're going to jump right to their absolute peak, to a moment that was so dominant, it almost sounds made up. And it all boils down to this one little number, 5. Just 5. Doesn't seem like much on its own, right? But believe me, this single digit stands for a moment in music history that was so totally dominant, it's never, ever been repeated.
Because on April 4th, 1964, one band, just one band, held all top 5 spots on the American pop charts. At the same time. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. This wasn't just having a hit song. This was a complete, total, never-seen-before takeover of the entire music industry.
And here it is. I mean, just look at the sheer scale of this. You've got Can't Buy Me Love at number 1, Twist and Shout right behind it at 2, then She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and Please Please Me. The entire top 5, all of them. One band. It wasn't just a big deal, it was like a cultural earthquake.
But wait, it gets even crazier, because it wasn't just the top 5. That very same week, the Beatles had a mind-blowing 12 songs in the Hot 100. And get this, it wasn't some big, coordinated strategy from a record label. Nope. It was actually 4 different labels, all scrambling to release anything and everything they had by the band. Why? Because the public demand was just so insane, the industry itself literally could not keep up.
So you see, this goes way beyond just having a few hit records. It was a shockwave. Which brings us to the big question, right? How on earth did 4 guys from Liverpool manage to conquer the world's biggest music market so completely, so fast?
Well, to understand that insane chart domination, we gotta rewind the clock just a couple of months. We need to go back to the exact moment the fuse was lit, the day they landed in America.
70 million plus. That is the insane number of people who are estimated to have watched the Beatles' very first performance on The Ed Sullivan Show. To put that into perspective for you, that was over 40% of the entire US population at the time, all tuned in, watching the same 4 guys at the exact same moment. And yeah, that one TV appearance, it basically unleashed a phenomenon the world had just never seen before. They even had to coin a new word for it, Beatlemania. We're talking about a fan frenzy so intense that the screaming at their concerts would literally drown out the music. You couldn't even hear them play. Retailers were totally swamped. They couldn't keep the records on the shelves. It was just pure, unfiltered hysteria. But, you know, all that pressure, the global fame, the constant deafening screaming, it eventually became kind of creatively suffocating. And it pushed the band to make a really radical decision, one that would end up changing pop music forever. They were getting so frustrated that nobody could even hear the music they were playing. I mean, their songs were getting more and more complex, and it was all just lost in the noise. So they did something unthinkable. They quit touring. Completely. After 1966, the Beatles weren't a live band anymore. They became something totally new. The world's first true studio artists. And a huge part of this whole transformation was their producer, the legendary George Martin. His classical background was like their secret weapon. Take the song Yesterday, for example. Paul McCartney brings in this beautiful, simple acoustic ballad, but George Martin's vision was bigger. He says, let's add a classical string quartet. Now, Paul was a little hesitant at first, he thought it might sound too stuffy, but the result? Whoa. It was something brand new, this incredible blend of pop and classical that totally blew open the definition of what a pop song could even be. So once they made that shift into the studio full-time, it just unleashed this tidal wave of creativity. I mean, think about it. Their early stuff was classic rock and roll, perfect for playing live. But their later albums, like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's, that's a whole different universe. Suddenly, they're experimenting with everything. Indian sitars, backward tape loops, full orchestras. These were sounds that you couldn't replicate in a stadium. They were made for your headphones, for you to really listen to. And it wasn't just the music that was evolving either. If you look at the words they were writing, their lyrics, you can actually track this really profound psychological journey that was happening inside the band. In fact, if you analyze their lyrics, you can see 3 pretty distinct phases. The early stuff is all very direct, very positive, all those immediate feelings of young love, right? She loves you, I want to hold your hand. Then, as they hit their creative peak in the studio, the The lyrics get way more complex, more introspective. And then, in those final years, they turn darker, more psychologically distant. And here's the really interesting part. This isn't just, a vibe or a feeling. It's actually measurable. When you analyze the words they used, you see a clear statistical trend. The number of positive emotion words they used dropped off a cliff as their career went on, while the use of negative words just kept on climbing. So what was driving this change? A lot of it was that creative friction right at the heart of the band. John Lennon summed it up perfectly himself when he talked about his dynamic with Paul McCartney. He said Paul always brought the lightness, the optimism, while he, John, would always go for the sadness, the discord, the bluesy notes. And that exact push and pull, that was the engine of their genius. But here's the thing, that same creative fire, the very thing that made them so brilliant, also, tragically, held the seeds of their inevitable breakup. You can see the cracks starting to form. The sudden, unexpected death of their manager, Brian Epstein, in '67, really left them without a rudder. Then the tensions just boiled over when they were recording the White Album. I mean, they were barely working as a unit anymore, often recording in separate studios. That collaborative magic was just fading, and it all culminated in that famous final performance up on that London rooftop.
And then in 1970, after only about a decade together, it was over. Let It Be came out as their final studio album. It was kind of a bittersweet ending, wasn't it? An epitaph for the band that had in just 10 short years completely changed the world. Which really leaves us with one final question, one final thought. Was a force that creative ever gonna last? The Beatles' career was like a supernova, right? A dazzling, brilliant explosion of creative energy. But maybe it was just too intense to burn forever. In just 10 years, they completely redefined what a band could be. And perhaps, just perhaps, their breakup wasn't a failure, but the only possible ending for a phenomenon that burned so brightly. So, when you think about the Beatles breaking up, what's the story you know? It's probably the one we all know, right? Fights in the studio, creative clashes, all that personal drama. But what if that's not the whole story? Not even close. I mean, even Paul McCartney joked about it. And honestly, this quote, it's kind of the perfect summary of the myth we've all bought into. It boils everything down to this really simple, personal thing. Yoko shows up, the whole vibe changes, and boom, the band is doomed. That's the story. And hey, it's a great story. It's super compelling. It's about friendships, falling apart, artistry just crumbling. For over 50 years, the narrative has been that all those tensions from the White Album just boiled over, that they just couldn't stand to be in the same room anymore. It's a classic human drama, and it's easy to understand. But what if all that studio drama was just the opening act? What if the real final nail in the coffin wasn't a fight over a guitar riff, but a battle over contracts, money, and trademarks? Well, that's what we're gonna get into. We're gonna dig into the long, messy legal war that actually broke up the Beatles. All right, so let's get right to it. The official end. Yeah, guys walked out of sessions all the time. That was nothing new. Those were just flare-ups. The real, final, no going back moment, that happened with a lawsuit. So picture this. It's New Year's Eve, 1970, and Paul McCartney walks into the High Court in London and sues the other three Beatles. He's not just quitting, he's asking a judge to legally blow up their entire business partnership. Their company, the Beatles & Co., was officially on the chopping block. This was the point of no return. So what pushed him to do it? Well, it really boils down to one guy, Alan Klein. You see, John, George, and Ringo had hired Klein as their manager, and Paul was having none of it. He wanted his father-in-law, Lee Eastman, to handle things. This wasn't just, a small disagreement. This was a fundamental split right down the middle of their business that basically froze everything. And here's a fun little aside that shows you what people thought of Klein. Ever seen The Ruddles? The hilarious Beatles parody? Well, the character Rhonda Klein is totally based on Alan Klein. And this line from the movie just nails it. It perfectly captures that sense of financial shadiness that Paul was so worried about. And ironically, the other three would end up suing Klein themselves a few years down the line. So that lawsuit Paul filed, it dragged on for 4 long years. And the way it finally ended is just bizarre. The very last signature needed to officially dissolve the Beatles was John Lennon's. And where did he sign the papers? At Disneyland, during a family vacation.
Think about that for a second. The end of a global phenomenon finalized at the happiest place on Earth. You can't make this stuff up. But okay, you'd think that would be the end of it, right? Nope. Dissolving the band was just the beginning. The legal fights didn't go away. They just morphed into something new, following each of them into their solo careers and turning their music into evidence. Okay, let's take George Harrison. His first solo single, My Sweet Lord, was a monster hit. I mean, it was everywhere. But almost right away, bam, he gets sued for plagiarism. The publisher of a 1963 song by the Chiffones called He's So Fine claimed the melodies were basically the same. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The judge's final verdict came down to this idea of subconscious plagiarism. He basically said, look, I don't think you meant to steal it, George, but you heard that other song years ago, it got stuck in your head, and you accidentally copied it without even knowing. That ruling was a huge deal, and it completely freaked out the music industry. And just when you think it can't get any weirder, it does. Guess who swoops in and buys the rights to He's So Fine, right in the middle of all this? Alan Klein, the same Alan Klein. So now, George's old manager is literally the person suing him. The judge even called him out on it, but that didn't stop the legal nightmare from dragging on and on. So what does George do? He's totally fed up with the whole thing, so he does what he does best. He writes a song about it. It's called This Song, and it's just this brilliant, sarcastic takedown of the entire lawsuit. The lyrics are all about lawyers and copyright, and he even shot the music video in a courtroom. It was his way of getting the last word. And George wasn't the only one. John Lennon had his own mess with Come Together. That opening line, Here Come Old Flat Top, was a little too close to a Chuck Berry song. The publisher sued, and to settle it, John agreed to record a few songs from their catalog. But even that settlement fell apart and led to another lawsuit. It's like the courtroom just followed them everywhere they went. So on top of all the creative lawsuits, there were these massive fights over cold, hard cash. They had earned a fortune, but they had this sinking feeling they weren't actually seeing all of it. So in 1979, their own company, Apple Corps, goes after their US record label, Capitol. And the accusations were pretty explosive. They basically said Capitol was cheating them. They claimed the label was hiding sales figures, saying millions of records were scrap or damaged, and then secretly selling them out the back door without paying the band a dime in royalties. As you can imagine, that lawsuit was a beast. It dragged on for 10 years. Now, the final number was kept secret, but the word on the street was that the settlement was somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 million. Just think about that. That's the kind of money we're talking about here. But you know, for all those huge astronomical numbers, this quote from Linda McCartney just brings it all back to a really human level. It perfectly captures how exhausting it all was. That all this money was just going to lawyers and advisors, paying for their kids to go to fancy schools. They were spending a fortune just to get the fortune they had already earned. And the fights didn't stop with the record companies either. Oh no. The Beatles' own company, Apple Corps, got tangled up in another massive legal battle that would last for decades. And this time, it was all about its name. This story is just incredible. So back in 1978, the Beatles' Apple finds out about this tiny little startup in California that's also calling itself Apple. So they sue them. And that little company? Yeah, that was Steve Jobs and Apple Computer. They settled pretty quickly, with the computer guys promising to stay out of the music business, but we all know how that turned out. As technology changed, they kept clashing. There was a lawsuit in the 90s over sound chips, and then the big one in the 2000s over iTunes. This fight between the two Apples went on for almost 30 years. So, okay, let's take a step back and look at the whole picture. You've got the lawsuit to officially break up the band, you've got the lawsuits over their solo music, the huge battles for their own royalties, and then this epic trademark war. When you add it all up, a totally different story of their breakup starts to take shape. And here's the bottom line. The breakup of the Beatles wasn't one sad event in 1970. Not at all. It was a slow, agonizing, and unbelievably expensive legal war that stretched on for nearly 15 years. You know, The Long and Winding Road wasn't just a great song. For them, it was reality. So let's just break it down one last time. The myth? It's all about personal drama in the studio. But the reality? It was a tangled mess of lawsuits. It was about ending a business, fighting over who wrote what, clawing back money from their own record labels, and even fighting for their own name. And all of this leaves us with one big question, right? The Beatles made some of the most beautiful, timeless music ever. So does knowing about all the ugly, messy,
decades-long business fighting that went on behind the curtain, does that change how you hear the music? Something to think about next time you put on one of their records.